delighted to be here. For many years, I had a long engagement with Christ University. I used to do workshops and I remember my last visit was actually last year for the Kannada Sangha. I gave a talk on philosophy and literature. Actually, I didn't know that David. It's been one of my most seen YouTube talks. And so every time somebody writes to me about it, I remind about Christ and we have English marketing literature. As I said that, I had many friends here. It's lovely to be back, lovely to talk to all of you. I'm really delighted, particularly, to come here to speak from a different context. But every time I come, it's always to do some philosophy workshop. The last time, for the Kannada Sangha, it was about a novel which was just released that time. But now I'm really delighted to actually come and engage with this new novel, which I had the pleasure of reading, and also to meet Araathu and Charu and the group of people around. Charu is not just a writer, because Charu is more than a writer. He is an institution. In other words, he has people behind it. It's not just about somebody writing a book, and it's actually about somebody who is able to influence people to look at the world differently, to look at writing differently. And I must confess that I too belong to this larger Anglo-centric world, particularly while I do write in Kannada and Tamil. And I do a lot of workshops, particularly in Kannada recently. But in terms of literature, my engagement has always been with English literature. And English literature from different contexts. One, of course, is you're growing up. I'm a product of Bangalore as a student of the enemy College of Christ, Joseph's. In our time, it's changed a lot now, but in our time when I was a student here, we would never come to Christ. Christ was seen as a Runda college, and we thought we were going to college. It's changed a lot. I think it's reversed. But the point is, at that time, the engagement with literature, and I was a science student, I was not a literature student. I have great love for literature in terms of what it uses, but I was never, in terms of an academic discipline, it didn't draw. And I was basically a student of science. My real interest was in physics, and then I shifted to physics and philosophy. So my training is in physics and philosophy. But I could never step away from the larger questions of literature. And in that time, what the books that influenced me most deeply as a student who was not in literature but was reading a lot of these books were all these really, books which were challenging modes of life. I remember as a teenager, James Joyce was a great, for me it was like a revelation. It was a revelation because, I couldn't read it. I didn't understand it. But to me, what was happening in Ulysses and the related story was not about the story, it was not about how a story is told, in what kind, because at the same time I was also a great fan of detective work. In those days with Araathu Christian, then other writing. So it is two completely different worlds, right? And to me there is something about Joyce and the idea of language. Okay? It's not about telling a story. So language is not a transparent medium to tell a story. And I think for many of these contemporary works, it challenges this question of literature. It is not just about telling what new stories you can say. It's about how you can tell a story. And like as I did in my novel Following a Prayer, for me it was not about telling some story about whatever was happening, whether it's resolved or not. But it's about asking the question, do you have the language to carry the story? In other words, language itself is a character, language itself is something you just travel. And to me, when I then beyond my teen, and I was very interested in various other kinds of British writing, including Martin Amis and others. And I was always wondering, why is it that we in India don't write those books in English. Okay, I'm saying all this as a leader to why such books are very important. Okay? I am not a fan, and I should be saying this in public like this, especially some people. I'm not a fan of Indian literature. Okay. Why? Not because there are no good writers. It is because the publishing industry is so conservative. It's really, for me when I was reading those books, I said, why are we not writing books like, you write something like Joyce, it's difficult, it's challenging. And somebody might say, why do you want to read? Who's going to read it today? So the publishers are writing something like that. But at the age in which all of you are, those days in which I remember briefly, the age in which I was, we are thinking of the word very differently. We are thinking of the word not as a well-established middle class, family person who wants to say something about the word. We are thinking about the word by challenging the question. In that sense, that's what Charu is doing, even at this level. He's beginning to not let society sterilize, not let society make you another product of that, which is reflected in the way we write. To me, the problem with Indian English writing was the fact that it could discover some interesting stories here or there, but with a kind of engagement with the question of language, taking ownership of language. James Joyce could write, if I wrote something like that, people would say, you don't know how to write English. Your editing is very bad. This is not the way you should write English. If James Joyce writes it, that's Nobel quality, right? So, to me, the problem was, how do you then look at literature in these kinds of forms of experiments that have been happening, as I said, not just with Joyce, with the whole philosophical school that existentialist among the French, I'm sure all of you in your courses will read that. And in a sense, for me, the existentialist writing, which is captured very famously by Sartre and Camus and others, mixed with the magic realism, surrealism of South American writers, really comes together when I first encountered Charu. And, it was actually a great accident of things by which I even got to know Charu. It's a pity I didn't know him earlier. I got an email from him once. He's very generously responded to my novel, which was, as I said, I don't think it's resolved. For me, it's just a simple story. And it's very rare to find writers being generous about that. It's a part of the politics of the community. And I had heard of it from my very good friend who is also my Tamil translator about his work, etc. But I had not read anything in Tamil. The opportunity reading came through his English translations. And that's, I think, for those who he was talking about Zero Degree, it's a really remarkable book. For me, when I first read Zero Degree and then even his latest book, it was actually about finding that void which I thought was a problem in Indian English writing. The capacity to look at experimental writing without sacrificing the spirit of what I would think is great storytelling. So I said, laws is difficult in various ways. Sometimes you don't know what is it about storytelling or what kind of genre it fits into. But my encounter with Charu in that sense really opened up the possibility of this kind of writing now present in English. Now, this is very odd. There's also the politics of English writing versus language, right? And it's very important to recognize that even language writing, a lot of well-known Indian language writing is also conservative. It's not that this is what mainstream Tamil writing is. Right? There's a lot of conservativeness about stories, about language, about structure of a novel, right from that particular point of view. So I think what really opened up, of course, as philosophy students, we do have to somewhere, whether we follow that or not, we would look at modernist thought and then postmodern thought, which is largely made, how that's been made very popular by the English literature department. It's something which, has very big philosophical root, at least from the Canadian tradition, who comes as a philosopher of these concepts and the larger principles. Um, so when I discovered that these are writers who are also consciously presenting themselves as existentialist postmodern writers, I was obviously also more interested to see what is that structure which is really operating in that way. And as you could see in Charu's work earlier, there is always a question about authorship. It's a very important postmodern theme, and Charu has talked about in classes. It's also something which he's able to bring into the text, into the story in a very interesting. You have to read this. Really appreciate it. Araathu continues that tradition in this as the first translating work of the It is a work which, as Charu himself, when I comment on this book, calls it an existential classic. It does deal with very important existentialist themes. Now, existentialist themes are something which, again, it's something which is so central to all of us, particularly the kind of time we live in. A very fragmented society, a very dispersed society, something which is completely influenced by social media as one example, completely fragmented. How do you then tell a coherent narrative when you are this fragmented as an individual? Where is that coherence in our world coming from? In our life experience coming from? And I think that idea, which some people would say leads to questions about and absurdity and loneliness. Themes which Charu mentioned, also themes like angst and absurdity, which are seen to be central themes of existentialist thought. As students of literature, all I can tell you to bring in one aspect of philosophical thinking is we should remember that these terms as used in 50s and 60s European, particularly the French community, are quite different from the kind of experiences which characterize these words. So, I think part of the great possibility of literature, to some extent, is to see how do these ideas play out daily. And first of all, why should existentialism itself matter? Is it that our lives are like that today? Is it that I often call many philosophers get very historically for saying this, but I often look at Nietzsche as a teenage philosopher because it's in teenage I read Nietzsche, and I'm very difficult for me to read him now. It's a teenage philosophy because that's the time you are ready to take on. You don't want to listen to conventions. You want to say, I want to do that, I want to do that. And Nietzsche writes like that. He gives you the freedom to think, I can be really crazy. It's okay to be quote unquote mad. A term we don't like to use now, but a very important term within the context of what Nietzsche was writing about. Right? And for him, these questions about society which Charu was talking about are extremely important. How do you respond to society? How do you respond to the potential imprisonment of social norms on an individual life? That's not just a philosophical question. That's a question that literature can deal with. And how you deal with it is also something you need to have some skill. You need to have some way of, otherwise I can tell you this too. Many of the existentialist novels can also become very tiring to read. Why? Because many times when they are, stream of consciousness, they are constantly about one person's obsession about something, about, let's say, their life or extreme detailed and, account of everything that's happening in his life. Imagine if I read every sentence of 1 hour of my life and I'm writing everything down. At some point you're going to ask, why? Why do I want to read your, for your whole detailed analysis of it? So, writing like that alone does not make it complete. There has to be something which is going to draw upon your experiences, your own questions of existential angst. The very important term which arises from existentialist thought. That angst, okay, and the angst, remember that one central point. Angst is not about worrying or fearing something. The central core principle of this is captured angst is what? There is nothing to worry about. There's nothing to be anxious about. And yet you have butterflies in the stomach. If I know who the enemy is and it will say, that's the enemy I can deal with. But angst is just about your existence. Why am I there? What am I doing here? Who am I? Those kinds of questions about that seems to drive a lot of very important literary writing. So I'm saying all this as a preface because I want to know first, and I'm sure that those of you who read this, you want to first know, I mean, when I started this program in humanities in Manipal, left NIAS, I was working for a long time. So I wanted to start a center for, philosophy and humanities. And because it is a master's program, I designed a philosophy course which all our philosophy students had to study literature, sociology, and philosophy. So I didn't think that one should just study philosophy as an independent discipline without looking at literature and sociology, without understanding society or without understanding humans. Okay? Because I thought it was a very exciting experiment, and many of us were involved with it, and we did very well, I thought. But now it's become completely English, philosophy, sort of. But the point is, why I was saying that is, in writing about these kind of questions, you need to find a balance between a particular literary genre as well as drawing upon various other ideas. It's what Charu teaches. That's why he's repeatedly referring back to the question of, philosophy within literature. And today, lot of philosophy, in fact, more of philosophy, which is also my company, in a good sense. Abilash's own book on Heidegger, he just reminded me that he had sent it to me a couple of years back, right? Fortunately, I never had a chance to talk to him after that. First time I came in, really grateful for this opportunity. Lot of philosophy being done in English department. And I blame postmodernism because it really got today in India. If you want to philosophy, the philosophy departments are very few. Everybody had closed the philosophy department. When Bangalore City University started, so that vice chancellor said, "Can you start a philosophy department?" So I went and set up a philosophy group for MA in philosophy. They ran for 2 years and I closed it. Nobody wants to do philosophy as a discipline. But if you want to search for where philosophy is happening, it's happening in books, it's happening in Charu's novels, it's happening in Araathu's novels, it's happening in your department. And at some level, I do have a problem with it because I want to hold on to my disciplinary thing and say, no, why is all you guys are doing and nobody philosophers are doing? But I also realize it has liberated philosophy. It has made it far more lighter. It's made it far more accessible, made it, brought it out into very different kind of domains. Okay? So, in that sense, why I was talking about the Manipal thing is the first course we did for Masters in Manipal, any student who came in that program, was to do a book on reading. The course is called Reading and Writing. We didn't start with any text. We said, unless you know how to read and write, what are you going to read? How are you going to read this book? Forget about reading philosophy books. How do you read Charu's book? 0 degree. You have to, unless you have a framework for reading, you won't say, what is this? What are people writing about? Right? So there's a framework for it. How do I read this? So, when I looked at this book, in terms of the context of the story, it actually stuck very close to me because I have a very close childhood friend who is a filmmaker, who has done films in India. He has worked with Tamil film extensively. He was an assistant to Modernism and Kamal. And, when he was in Chennai, when I was there for a couple of years there, he would come stay with us and very closely, childhood friend, as I said. Many of the stories you have written here are the stories I've heard from him. He was an assistant director. So this book is about a larger question. It's not about an assistant director, film director, but it's about that whole idea of a film. And for me, I'm sure as literature students, all of you will read it in different ways. For me, the framework of a film itself is a very important framework to read this. Right? Because when you look at it as a framework as a film, the film is the biggest myth that we all live. The film is in your face false. In your face. There's nothing happening. The actors are not on the screen. Nothing is happening as it's happening. In your face, it's completely false, and yet all our ideas of reality are so much deeply invented. So that's why, a lot of philosophy, very interesting philosophy is being around studies of film studies and other things. So for me, the story was very familiar. The first one. Okay? The kind of terrible, nasty stories I've heard about how they treat us with actors, how they treat actors and actresses particularly in Tamil film industry is shocking. And I don't think it's any different in any other industry. It's the same thing. It's horrible, it's inhuman. Okay? How are you going to write? What kind of writing should you have to do really? It's a very difficult thing for me to even think about writing. So when I read this, I said, so the first thing I'm going to do is to talk to my friend about this. Tell him, look, that actually it is possible to write about this kind of a thing. But he's not doing a linear story of it. Okay? This is, I mean, as I said, you will have to bring your framework to read the story. I think the framework of films itself is a very interesting story. What is myth and what is not? What is false, what is not? That itself is a story. That's a framework by which you can read this extremely complicated question of what happens in this particular book. Now, there is another aspect in your confrontation with, and this is a question which is often troubled me in the sense how to make sense of it, and I just stop at this point because I think it's a very important point to think about. Many of you will be writers and want to write. You know, one of the greatest reactions to society, social norms, the way in which society, you know, many of the social norms are actually built to propagate certain norms of sexuality. That's really one of the most important functions of social norms, whether it's in terms of what one should dress, how women should behave or men should behave, you know, and the whole idea around sexuality. Okay? Now, if you are writing about society in its rawness, in the way in which it confronts you, then you have to ask as a writer, how do you confront writing the possibility of sex and sexuality? What does it mean to you? How does literature, I mean, great literature can be around this theme. But there's also very conventional literature which finds it impossible to talk about it. Right? How do you work with it? Because remember that any engagement with this you know, larger category of sexuality can even push the book into different kind of genres. There is right from pornographic to highly literary text. So how does one engage with writing about it? And what does one do as a writer when one writes about sex? Is it to titillate something? Is it a kind of a entertainment which is being provided to the reader? Or is it something so fundamental to storytelling, of human life, of human existence? In fact, a lot of the question of angst about existence is related to these notions of sexuality and the kind of social norms on sexuality. So, I think, you know, for a writer to be able to do it with a level of honesty and a level of engaging with the deeper themes around it is extremely difficult. And I think in Araathu, we actually able to do this very interestingly. So, and of course, I saw that first, as you said, in 0 degree, in the way Charu also deals with some of the themes. So, that's why I said what Charu has done is it's not just about one writer, one novel. It's also about building an institution of writing, which enables us to think about these themes, which enables us to write about this. So, you know, there's very little, there's a lot more we could talk about, but it's such a pleasure being sharing this beautiful work. Wonderful Charu and Araathu and wonderful. Thank you.